Hello, it is Ryan, and I was on a flight the other day playing one of my favorite social spin slot games on ChumbaCasino.com. I looked over at the person sitting next to me, and you know what they were doing? They were also playing Chumba Casino. Coincidence? I think not. Everybody's loving having fun with it. Chumba Casino is home to hundreds of casino-style games that you can play for free anytime, anywhere, even at 30,000 feet. So sign up now at ChumbaCasino.com to claim your free welcome bonus. That's ChumbaCasino.com and live the Chumba life.
No purchase necessary. VGW. Void where prohibited by law. See terms and conditions. 18+.
Please be advised, this episode does have content that some may find distressing. As always, listener discretion is advised and it is not suitable for anyone under the age of 13. Hello and welcome to It's Murder Up North. And this, the next episode in the Wakefield Prison series. Although it is not the White House Farm murders mentioned at the end of the Dennis Nielsen arc, for which I am still researching and compiling the scripts, it is another compelling case. That being said, let's get started on today's episode. As of 2023, there were approximately 65 inmates who had been issued whole life tariffs, a sentence reserved for individuals who would pose a high risk to society should they ever be released. Many of these have or still reside behind the walls of Wakefield Prison. This includes Robert Maudsley, Dennis Nielsen, and Mark Robinson. Another member of this select few is Victor Miller, and in today's episode I shall delve into his life, crimes, and remember Stuart Gough, the 14-year-old boy who died at Miller's hands. The city of Des Moines in Iowa has little in common with the village of Hagley near Wolverhampton in Worcestershire, except for the fact that the presence of boys and girls delivering newspapers used to be a common sight. Whether they were riding a bike, walking, or pulling a wagon, these youngsters were a common image in popular culture, being featured in films and even a computer game. The 1980s would be a turning point in this method of delivering newspapers, with the use of children under 18 declining. While the decline has been slower in the UK, the internet, smartphones, and 24-hour news channels would reduce the demand for papers, and in turn diminish the requirements for them to be delivered directly to people's homes. In its heyday, a paper round was a means for youngsters to earn some extra money, while learning about responsibility and timekeeping, waking up early and facing any weather to ensure the paper was on the porch or pushed through the letterbox. It was a task undertaken by thousands of boys and girls in both America and the UK, and for the most part it was considered to be safe, with them usually carrying out their rounds in areas they were familiar with, and they were recognised by the residents. Yet this feeling of safety would be shattered during the 1980s, when the two communities of Des Moines and Hagley, although 7,000 miles apart, would experience remarkably similar incidents, which would alter people's perception of their seemingly safe streets. In 1982, 12-year-old Johnny Gosh lived in a quiet, family-friendly neighbourhood in West Des Moines, Iowa, with his mother Noreen, father John, and an older brother. Every morning and evening, Johnny would deliver the Des Moines Register newspaper, usually accompanied by at least one member of his family and their dog. Yet, in the early hours of Sunday the 5th of September 1982, the 12-year-old set off with just his beloved dog and a red wagon, making his way to the corner of 42nd and Ashworth, where Johnny, along with the other delivery boys and girls, collected their bundles of papers. One of the last sightings of him that day came from another delivery boy, who observed Johnny talking to a man in a car, with the witness overhearing the individual asking the youngster for directions. After a brief conversation, the vehicle drove away, and Johnny began walking a short distance up the road to a spot where he usually organised his round. Meanwhile, at his home, Johnny's absence had been noted, but his parents weren't initially concerned, as they believed he had just gone out to do his round alone. It was only when the couple began receiving phone calls from neighbours asking where their papers were that the parents started to suspect something untoward had occurred. The couple thought it was possible that Johnny was simply running late, but wanting to ensure that he hadn't had an accident of some sort, John set off to retrace his son's steps. As he approached the corner where Johnny usually organised his round, the father would find only the family dog and his son's red four-wheeled wagon, with the papers still bound, suggesting the boy had been disturbed before he had been able to open them. John looked around his surroundings, but there was no sign of the 12-year-old on the quiet suburban street, with his disappearance remaining a mystery that has haunted the city of Des Moines to this day. One of the main criticisms regarding Johnny Gough's case would be the manner in which the police handled the investigation and how they treated the family, with Noreen claiming that there seemed to be a lack of urgency regarding looking for her son, with suggestions being made that Johnny had simply run away from home. This attitude seemed evident when Jean Meyer from the Iowa Division of Criminal Investigation told reporters that they, quote, had nothing to indicate that there was a kidnapping, which seemed a ridiculous assertion given Johnny's wagon full of papers and his beloved dog had been abandoned on a street corner. Feeling that law enforcement were letting the case go cold, Noreen and John began to rely on the press in order to keep it in the public eye, a fight they have continued over the last 4 decades. But their battle has not been without criticism, with some people at the time of her son's disappearance accusing Noreen in particular of scaremongering. Despite this, Noreen continued her campaign to find her son, with her warning that whoever took Johnny could strike again. A claim which seemed to be chillingly prophetic, when on August 12, 1984, almost 2 years after her son had disappeared, another paperboy would go missing from the streets of Des Moines. 13-year-old Eugene Martin disappeared just 5 miles away from Johnny's last known location. He was also a delivery boy for the Des Moines Register, with him vanishing under similar circumstances to Johnny. A third incident occurred in 1986, when Mark Allen, who lived just a mile away from where Eugene was last seen, left his home to go to a sleepover at a friend's house, but he never arrived, with his mother only becoming aware he was missing the following morning when he failed to return home. While this last case did not share the same circumstances as Eugene and Johnny's, in that it took place on a night and Mark was not delivering newspapers at the time, there are some similarities, namely the boys' ages, gender, and the location, combined with the fact that all 3 were employed as paperboys, which does suggest some sort of link between them, although the police have not formally connected Mark's case, with the force at the time treating him as just another runaway. Johnny, Eugene, and Mark disappeared without a trace, with no bodies found and no explanation as to what happened to them. And while the population of the American city were left with unanswered questions, a similar case would unfold 7,000 miles away in the small English village of Hagley. Hagley was once a place which thrived through its agriculture, but it is now more popular with commuters who take advantage of its transport links, which allow access to the major towns and cities of the Midlands, such as Wolverhampton and Birmingham. This has seen the population grow slowly from the estimated 5,000 in 2001 to approximately 8,000 today. And these changes have meant that many things that once existed in Hagley have now gone, including the newsagents M&G Higgins, once located on Worcester Road, just a few doors away from the home of 14-year-old Stuart Gough. For 18 months, the teenager had worked as a paperboy for the shopkeepers Malcolm and Gillian Higgins, with him proving himself to be a punctual and reliable boy who had become a familiar figure as he carried out his daily round. And on Sunday the 17th of January 1988, he arrived at the shop promptly at 7:20 to collect his bag of papers. Anyone who has delivered papers on a Sunday may recall they were often filled with extra inserts such as the TV guide or lifestyle magazines, which added to the weight. As such, Stuart split the round into two sections. On that cold and foggy morning, with darkness still lingering over the village, Stuart left the paper shop with his first load, and was due to return for his next portion at roughly 8:20. But when he didn't appear at the expected time, the owner initially thought that the youngster had simply lost track of time. Maybe he had stopped to chat to a friend, or perhaps he was being cautious due to the fog. As the other paper boys and girls began to return their bags to the shop and collect their earnings, one bag was missing, and a pile of papers remained undelivered. Malcolm began to realise that something was wrong, as it was out of character for Stuart to abandon his duties. The worried shopkeeper placed a phone call to Stuart's parents, Geoffrey and Jean Gough, who confirmed that the 14-year-old had not returned home. As such, Malcolm volunteered to check along Stuart's route, fearful that the teenager may have been in an accident due to the fog, or had suffered an asthma attack brought on by the cold weather. Yet this cursory search yielded no results, and with no signs of Stuart Gough, the police were called. At that time, the police considered the most likely cause of his disappearance, given the initial evidence, was that the teenager had been abducted. And while this theory would be taken seriously, with a full-scale search being started immediately, other lines of inquiry were also explored, with investigators looking into Stuart's home and school life. Born on March 25, 1973, Stuart Geoffrey William Gough was the eldest of three boys, and he was particularly close to his siblings Mark, aged 11, and 12-year-old Richard. Living in the family's substantial home located on Worcester Road in Hagley, which was considered to be an affluent and safe area, Stuart had been taught to be respectful and take his responsibilities seriously. It was apparent that he came from a loving, stable, and close-knit family home, although not everything was perfect in the Gough household. Stuart's mother, Jean, worked as a nurse, and his father, Geoffrey, who was a local scout leader, had worked for the last 40 years at the British Leyland car manufacturing plant in Longbridge. However, he had recently been made redundant. Having struggled to find employment, father of three had taken a temporary position at the British Sugar Corporation factory in Kidderminster, where he was assigned the role of a first aid officer. Yet the week before Stuart disappeared, this job would end. How aware Stuart would have been of his parents' financial struggles is uncertain, but it was evident that they still strove to provide for their children, even saving up to buy their eldest son tickets so Stuart and his mum could attend the upcoming Michael Jackson concert. The music-loving Stuart, who would ensure he was home in time for the Top 40 charts, which played on the radio every Sunday afternoon, also enjoyed playing computer games. Aside from his asthma, Stuart was otherwise a healthy boy, who liked to play and watch tennis and support his favourite football team, Aston Villa. During the initial hours following his disappearance, a check of the teenager's bedroom revealed nothing was missing, which added to the suggestion that Stuart had not left voluntarily. But sometimes children hide things from their family, preferring to confide in their peers or a trusted adult, prompting police to question his fellow pupils, staff and friends from Heybridge High School. Stuart, a short, blonde-haired boy, was a quiet teenager, preferring to listen rather than talk. He had a large group of friends at school and had dated a number of girls, with everyone the police spoke to stating he had shown no signs of being upset, nor had he intimated a desire to run away. Another potential possibility was that he had suffered an asthma attack, particularly given the icy air that winter's day. There was still a chance he was lying somewhere along his paper route, perhaps obscured from view. A thorough search yielded no signs of the teenager, who constantly carried an inhaler, which had recently been refilled, giving him at least a week's supply, which also diminished the asthma attack theory. Officers were deployed to conduct door-to-door inquiries. Initially they focused on individuals who lived along the route of Stuart's paper round, where the teenager would have been a familiar sight as he traversed it every day carrying his load. It was determined that he usually visited around 64 homes during his Sunday route. However, on that morning he had split the load into two, with 26 papers for his first round. The paper shop was located on Worcester Road, which was a busy thoroughfare lined on either side with large, semi-detached and detached homes. And while police were keen to speak to anyone who may have been driving on the road that day or had seen something untoward, they were particularly interested in any sightings of Stuart or anything out of the ordinary on Newfield Road. This fed off Worcester Road and led to open fields, with investigators believing it was possibly one of the teenager's last known locations, as evidenced by witness Iris Willits, whose home was located on the relatively quiet Newfield Road. But like Worcester Road, Newfield was a wide, tree-lined thoroughfare with houses occupying either side. However, at 8 o'clock on a Sunday morning, both roads would have been virtually deserted. The lone paperboy making his way through the thick fog in the pre-dawn hours of that January morning would have been an easy target. Police needed to narrow down where along the route the 14-year-old may have been taken, and Iris Willett provided them with crucial information, as she had been Stuart's 26th drop and had received her paper that day, meaning that the paperboy would likely have been heading back to the shop in order to collect the second part of his round. Iris would later confide in a reporter, quote, "I could never have known I would be the last to hear anything of Stuart, and now I feel as sick and helpless as everybody else in the village." Her helplessness was echoed by other residents, who came out in force to assist in the search, as over 300 villagers braved the wintry chill to help check gardens and outbuildings. News quickly spread through the region, bringing individuals from further afield, all eager to help find Stuart. This large voluntary team were joined by more than 100 police officers, some on horseback, others with dogs, and when the sun had risen and burned the foggy blanket away, a helicopter and aeroplane circled the sky above, using thermal imaging to scan the sprawling farmland which surrounded the village. The police would begin to collate information provided by potential witnesses, including a 20-year-old woman who reported she had seen Stuart on Worcester Road shortly after he had left the shop with his first load of papers. The witness placed him near to the newsagents, but did not see anything she would have deemed unusual or suspicious. Although this account placed Stuart in the area, it did not serve to move the case forwards. As the quiet hamlet was swarmed by a hive of activity, 24 hours would pass with no sign of the missing boy. Meanwhile, members of the press descended to attend an appeal hosted by the police. During the press conference, Jean Gough fought back her tears in an attempt to appeal for her son's safe return. She managed to tearfully utter the plea, "Just bring him back," before becoming overwhelmed by her emotions, prompting Jean's friend and neighbour, Mrs. Pat O'Hara, to take over. Pat urged the potential abductor to return Stuart to his family unharmed. But she also addressed the teenager, reassuring him that he was not in any trouble had he disappeared voluntarily, stating, "If you are there, Stuart, and have done something, do not be frightened to come home. Your mum and dad love you, and if anyone has got him, don't hurt him." Alongside the pleas from those close to Stuart, the lead investigator on the case, Chief Superintendent Tony Warren, addressed those gathered, advising that they were eager to speak to anyone who may have seen the teenager. A photograph of Stuart dressed smartly in his school uniform was issued, with an additional description stating he was 5'3" tall and had last been seen wearing a grey ski jacket with green on the shoulders, a pair of jeans, grey trainers, and fingerless gloves. It was known that the teenager had £2 in his pocket, alongside an inhaler, and while Stuart was missing, so was his paper bag. As the conference was underway inside the village community centre, the systematic search continued, coordinated from a swiftly established incident room, where Stuart Gough lingered, wanting to be an integral part in the search for his son. While Stuart's frantic parents clung to the hopes he would be returned, others were filled with the fear that something terrible had happened and a kidnapper was in their midst. For Malcolm Higgins, the effect of this apprehension was felt in his shop, when a number of paper boys and girls had failed to turn up to do their rounds, while others arrived accompanied by their parents, too scared to let their child out of their sight. This fear was understandable, especially as many still recalled the high-profile case of Carl Bridgewater, which had occurred 10 years earlier and just 5 miles from Hagley. 13-year-old Carl, like Stuart, had been a paperboy, and he was in the process of carrying out his delivery on the 19th of September 1978. He rode his orange bike to one of his regular properties, Yew Tree Farm, an isolated house set back from a country road, surrounded by fields and dilapidated buildings. The occupants, 79-year-old Mary Poole and her cousin 76-year-old Fred Jones, were not at home that afternoon, and Carl had been asked to enter the rear porch and leave the newspaper on a chair. It is believed that in the process of doing this, the 13-year-old disturbed an intruder or intruders in the property, and he was shot at point-blank range in the head, his body being found later lying on the sofa in the living room. In 1979, 4 men were convicted of the crime, but in 1997 their convictions were overturned, leaving the murder of Carl Bridgewater unresolved. 10 years after Carl's death, parents were once again living in fear, wondering whether 14-year-old Stuart Gough had been involved in a similar situation, or had he been abducted. Carl Bridgewater's supposed killers were behind bars in 1988, causing police to rule out a possibility that the cases were linked, but other occurrences were considered. Officers looked into an incident reported the previous summer, in which a schoolboy was approached by a man in a car. There was also the account of a 15-year-old who would stand in as Stuart during a police reconstruction staged on Tuesday the 19th of January. The teenager later revealed he had given up his paper round after being followed. This reconstruction would prompt a couple from Erdington in Birmingham to make contact, stating they believed they had seen Stuart around the time he would have been returning to collect his second batch of papers. The pair had been visiting relatives and stopped at the newsagent's in Hagley at roughly 8:10 that Sunday morning. While there, they noticed a paperboy walking towards them, with the youth pausing to cross Worcester Road. The witnesses placed the boy within 10 yards of Newfield Road, and from their description of his height, frame and clothing, police suspected it was likely they had seen Stuart. But the couple drove off before they saw where the 14-year-old went next. Although this helped to further narrow down the time during which the abduction may have taken place, The pair were unable to provide details of any vehicles or people in the area at the time, leaving the investigation with little more to proceed with. Considering the prospect that there may have been other similar cases which could help further their own investigation, detectives reached out to other police forces around the country, with one such case being the abduction of 14-year-old paper girl Claire Henderson, 80 miles away in Cuddington, Cheshire. Claire's ordeal began on Friday the 15th of January 1988, during which she was held hostage for 7 hours, having been abducted while delivering papers. Her attacker, who had used the ruse of being a police officer before producing a knife and forcing the girl into the boot of his white car, then drove her 80 miles away from her home to a quarry near Belfastiniog, Wales. The terrified teenager trembled as the boot lid was flung open. Instructed to get out of the rear compartment at the point of a 4-inch knife, she found herself in an isolated location where she was sexually assaulted. The man then returned to his vehicle, leaving the traumatized girl lost and alone. For a further 4 hours, the teenager trudged through overgrown grasses, moorland and hills, making her way along rough dirt tracks before reaching signs of civilization. Aside from the fact they were both delivering newspapers, the two cases were differentiated by location and the victim's gender, with links to Claire's case being definitively ruled out on the 20th of January 1988, when her assailant was apprehended. He was Raymond Hewlett, who would go on to be a suspect in the murder of Leslie Molseed. On the same day that Raymond Hewlett was apprehended, there was a glimmer of hope for Stuart's family, when the BBC received a phone call from an individual claiming to be the kidnapper. In the brief message, he insisted they shut up and listen, adding that the missing boy Stuart is okay. I repeat, okay. The anonymous man would make another phone call. However, he would be unable to provide anything which proved he had the missing boy, with the caller getting key details wrong, including Stuart's name. This ultimately led investigators to believe that the man was not being truthful, and determined the calls were a cruel hoax. This heartless stunt added to the parents' despair, with Stuart Gough confiding to a Daily Mail reporter that he feared Stuart was deceased, a sentiment not shared by his wife, who stated, "I won't accept he is not coming back. I can only hope he hasn't suffered." The press had a particular interest in the case, especially due to the fact that Stuart had distributed their papers. This prompted 8 editors from some of the largest publications to come together, with the rivals offering a £25,000 reward, roughly £68,000 in today's money, while a local businessman would also put forward £5,000. Alongside these substantial rewards for information, the police were now certain Stuart had been abducted, and released details of Anthony Dingley's encounter, which occurred the day prior to Stuart's disappearance. 14-year-old Anthony attended the same high school as Stuart, and was a fellow paperboy in the village of Hagley. Unlike Stuart, who travelled by foot, Anthony would cycle around his route, and he had been working on delivering his papers on Saturday the 16th of January, when a dirty silver-grey car stopped him. The black male driver wound down his window to ask the teenager for directions to Birmingham. After a brief exchange, the car drove away and Anthony carried on his route. But he recalled later, quote, "I became concerned after the driver had passed me about 3 times, and then I was frightened. At one point I became concerned and hid myself and my bike behind a bush along one of the drives to a house, and stayed under the bush until the man had gone. So afraid of what the man's intentions may have been, the teenager had grabbed a fistful of rocks, prepared to defend himself, and he waited tentatively in his hiding space until he felt the coast was clear. Concerned that his mother would stop him from having a paper round, Anthony did not tell her about the incident, but he would come forward upon learning of Stuart's disappearance, feeling that his incident may be pertinent. It seemed the man in the vehicle had remained in the area that Saturday, as 4 hours after Anthony's encounter, a 25-year-old woman out walking her dog was approached by an individual who matched Anthony's description. This suggested that the man had been prowling the area in search of potential targets. A suspicion reinforced when investigators decided to revisit another incident, which had been reported just 2 days prior to Stuart's disappearance. 18-year-old Richard Holden had just finished his shift at a slaughterhouse close to Wellington near Hereford. As he cycled down Jays Lane, an isolated country road, a vehicle pulled up beside him and asked for directions, which the teenager happily provided and watched as the car drove away. Continuing his journey on the lonely road, Richard informed police what happened next, stating, "He jumped out of nowhere, put a knife to my throat, and drugged me with chloroform." Richard came to on the back seat of a moving vehicle, and as his blurry eyes began to focus, he observed that the driver was the black male who had asked him for directions. The car came to a halt, although Richard had no notion of how long they had been travelling or where they were. The car door was swung open, and the man grabbed hold of the 18-year-old, forcing him out of the vehicle and onto the ground. Still disorientated from the chloroform, the teenager was initially unable to fight back, as he was dragged across the rough earth into an orchard, where his attacker proceeded to remove Richard's boots, trousers, and underwear. But the cold January air helped to rouse the boy from his stupor, and he fought back. The 18-year-old recalled, "I kicked him in the groin and made a run for it. I had to jump over barbed wire and push through a hedge to escape. I think he would have killed me if I had not gotten away. He was off his head." Richard made his way to a nearby home, knocking on the door and calling out for help, explaining that he had escaped a man who had kidnapped him. The female occupant of the property was alone at the time, and feared the caller might have been trying to con his way into her home. Therefore, she called the police. When officers arrived at the scene, they questioned the partially clothed Richard, who was visibly shaken. However, the boy's mother would later disclose that initially her son wasn't taken seriously, and it was only after Stuart's disappearance that they revisited him to take a full account of what had happened. Richard's encounter suggested to investigators that the 18-year-old had been approached by the same man who had interacted with Anthony the following day. Both boys described a black male driving a dirty silver Datsun Sunny. Richard would assist police by helping create a sketch of the man whom he recalled being in his mid-20s with short black hair. He was wearing a crew-neck jumper, with the teenager also noting the individual had an unusual and strong body odour. A week after Stuart's abduction, police had collated a description of a man and a vehicle of interest, and while searches for this individual were underway, Stuart's mum made another heartfelt plea. Describing the impact her son's disappearance was having on the family, she sobbed, "It is just as though I am in a dream. Every morning when I get up, I think that I will find Stuart getting his breakfast in the kitchen, as he always did. Every single day we have to adjust to the reality that it isn't a dream. I will do anything to get him back. I keep thinking I'll see him. I only wish that we had had a blazing row before he went out last Sunday. At least I could cling to the hope that he had run away, but we never used to argue. If he has been abducted and killed, perhaps in panic, I still want him back. He is my son, alive or dead, and I can't bear to think of his body just being dumped somewhere." While Jean clung to the hope Stuart would return home safe, her husband struggled to fight back the negative thoughts. He would admit, "I think my son is dead. I won't go to bed until Stuart is found. What keeps going through my mind is what his thoughts must have been if he has been snatched in the streets, what they did to him, if he was thrown in the boot of a car. I can't think how he would have reacted. What upsets me is I keep remembering the last time I saw him. He was going upstairs on Saturday night, and he just said, 'Good night, Dad.' I never saw him again." Meanwhile, the distraught couple had tried to retain a sense of normality for Stuart's brothers, Mark and Richard, who were still attending school as the search for their older sibling continued. It was a search which would be hampered as snow fell overnight on the 24th of January 1988. However, the teams persevered. They were determined to find any clues which could lead to Stuart being found. As with many investigations, the police would pursue many potential leads, with some more fruitful than others. And as the search efforts for Stuart continued into its second week, officers were seen walking the route the 14-year-old had traversed while delivering papers. Wielding a stopwatch and a notepad, Detective Chief Inspector Alan Scrafton, accompanied by Constable Chris Bason, attempted to gauge how long the round would have taken. Hoped they could use this to discern at which point the teenager had likely been abducted. Although the results would only be speculative, as no one as yet knew what had happened to the missing boy. Other means of eliciting clues were attempted by the police, who were willing to consider all avenues to help achieve a resolution in the case. As such, they turned to hypnosis, an unusual choice for a criminal investigation because in many cases the evidence acquired would not be admissible in court. But they felt the two key witnesses, Anthony Dingley and Richard Holden, may yield more information. As described on the Student Lawyer website, an individual under hypnosis experiences a level of awareness and mental functioning quite different to that which he experiences in the ordinary course of events. And it was hoped that this heightened state would allow the teenagers to access more details relating to their encounters. This decision was explained by Chief Superintendent Tony Warren, who stated, "We have never doubted Anthony's story. We know now that it actually happened. This was done to confirm his story and to see if Anthony remembered the incident well. Under hypnosis, there was a chance he might have remembered more." As a doctor from Lancashire conducted hypnosis sessions on the two boys, 17-year-old John Gregory was questioned by a journalist in regards to his choice to take over Stuart's delivery route. The teenager stated, quote, "I'm not worried about doing his round. I don't think if anyone took him, they would be stupid enough to come back around here." This was a sentiment shared by the investigators, who had begun to suspect that Stuart had been taken away from the area, with Alan Scrafton disclosing they had considered the possibility, as they had been unable to locate any of Stuart's belongings. During the first week, police had conducted a search of the Clent Hill area, located roughly 4 miles southeast of Stuart's last known location. Their initial inspection had proved fruitless, yet a tip would prompt them to return. The information had come from a 39-year-old man, who, at approximately 1:45 on the afternoon Stuart disappeared, was out hiking with his 8-year-old son, when he encountered an individual he felt seemed out of place on that freezing January day. It was the other male's general appearance which the hiker found notable, as he recalled that the man was, quote, "wearing trainers and lightweight clothing. There were only a few people walking the hills, and everyone else had Wellingtons and anoraks because the fog was quite thick. It was muddy and cold. He had a funny look in his eyes, sort of startled. We passed each other and he just stared ahead. When I got home, I told my wife about the funny chap I'd seen on the hills. Questions were raised as to why the witness hadn't come forward sooner, with it being 2 weeks since Stuart went missing. It was also noted that apart from seeing the man, who was inappropriately dressed for the conditions, the witness did not see what vehicle the individual had been driving. However, despite this scepticism regarding how pertinent the sighting was, a search team was redeployed to the area, but failed to find anything significant. While this failed to advance the investigation, the hypnosis session with Richard Holden would elicit additional details, including that the man was well built and approximately 5'7", and at some point during the abduction he had been wearing a grey woolen hat. But the most significant recollection of Richard's revolved around the vehicle his kidnapper had used. Under hypnosis, Richard had been able to discern that it may not have been a Datsun Sunny, but instead a Mitsubishi Sapporo. With greater clarity, the 18-year-old described the suspect's vehicle as being silver with a black vinyl roof, while inside it had a sandy-coloured interior, adding that the vehicle's exhaust rattled. These details were used to conduct a search through the DVLA in order to trace any owners of either a grey Datsun Sunny or Mitsubishi Sapporo, and on January the 27th, 1988, officers arrived at the home of a man who owned a late 1970s model two-door Mitsubishi Sapporo, and he fit the description provided by both Anthony and Richard. The man would be brought in for questioning with regards to Richard's abduction and the attempted sexual assault. He appeared at Hereford Magistrates Court on Friday the 29th of January, where he was officially charged with these offences, alongside a charge of making threats to kill the 18-year-old. But police suspected he may have been involved in Stuart's kidnapping, and they continued questioning the man, alongside a refocusing of search efforts to Staffordshire and parts of Wales, working on witness testimony which placed a vehicle matching one owned by the suspect in these areas shortly after Stuart was taken. Chief Superintendent David Cole would state, "We believe this car and driver were in the Mid Wales area between Tuesday, January the 12th and Thursday, January the 14th, and north for Mid Wales on Sunday, January the 17th, the day Stuart disappeared." As part of this change, officers appealed for the help of people who worked, lived or spent time in these areas to report sightings of this vehicle and to keep an eye out for signs of disturbed earth, items of clothing, an inhaler, and a paper delivery bag. This proved to be a startling turn of events, particularly with the request for people to be vigilant and report what could be perceived as a shallow grave, insinuating that investigators now believed Stuart was deceased. The man who now sat in the interview room was 32-year-old Victor Miller, who lived at Lennox Gardens, Penfield, Wolverhampton, roughly 16 miles north of Stuart's last known location. Miller had been apprehended alongside his partner Trevor Peacher, with both men being interviewed over 3 days regarding the ongoing investigation. Victor Miller was born in Wolverhampton in January 1955, less than 3 years after his parents, Hubert Miller and Joan Lacey, had married. However, theirs was a turbulent relationship, and when Victor was 5 years old, his mother left and had no further contact with her son. Following this, the child's behaviour grew increasingly concerning, with it being noted that Victor was, quote, emotionally disturbed, finding it hard to socialise with others, opting to be a loner, and he would hide for hours inside cupboards and wardrobes in the fetal position. At the age of 7, Victor's issues were still of concern, and it was decided he required specialist support, resulting in him being sent to a school for children who were, quote, disturbed and maladjusted, where they sought to address Victor's inability to control his emotions and manage his obsessive-compulsive tendencies. Victor would remain at the school for 8 years, after which he briefly returned to live with his father, but at 17 years old he would move out. Having minimal contact with Hubert, the teenager's life would descend into criminality. The school in which Victor had spent his formative years was Bodenham Manor, located approximately 50 miles away from Wolverhampton. The establishment was nestled in rolling countryside, surrounded by woodlands and open fields. The large Tudor-style property had been built between 1843 and 1844 on the site of a former rectory, using stone quarried from the expansive grounds, with the new rector, Reverend Henry Arkwright, and his family living there until his death in 1899. In the wake of his passing, the church, who had been given ownership of the property, deemed the home to be too large and returned it to the Hampton Court estate, which was owned by the Arkwright family, who were one of the wealthiest landowners in the country, and had been instrumental in the construction of the new rectory. The property would be renamed to Bodenham Manor, and for the next 50 years or so, it would be rented out, until November 1946, when the Birmingham Society for the Care of Invalid and Nervous Children purchased the property, which underwent major refurbishment before opening as Bodenham Manor School in March 1950. The school would exist as a co-educational facility until 1969, after which it only admitted boys. It was here that 7-year-old Victor Miller resided until he was 15, with the youngster becoming familiar with the area, including the Chase End Hill, which formed the southern part of the Malvern Hills. His familiarity with this area would be apparent when, on January 31, 1988, a convoy of police vehicles descended on a quiet country lane near Bromsborough, a village which lies near the foot of Chase End Hill. The sun had not yet risen as searchers, guided by torchlight, began combing through the undergrowth. Reaching a drainage gullet in a remote spot, they would find a partially clothed body, and signs that someone had attempted to conceal the remains by covering them with branches and leaves. Carefully removing these, the boy's pale skin became visible, his blonde locks of hair smeared with blood and dirt, and it was clear that his attacker had inflicted several injuries to his face, with a blood-stained rock located nearby the most likely cause of these wounds. The police had been taken to the scene by Victor himself, who had accompanied them to the area, but when they were close to where the body was discovered, he refused to go any further. Instead, he provided them a rough description of where his victim lay. Miller's name had come to the attention of police earlier in the investigation, with several people calling in to suggest him as a potential suspect. However, he had been ruled out when his partner, Trevor, had provided him with an alibi. Officers had initially called at the couple's home at Lennox Gardens, Wolverhampton, on the 20th of January to ascertain their movements on the day of Stuart's disappearance. Recalling what they had done 3 days earlier, 47-year-old Trevor stated, "On Sunday, January the 17th, I got up about 9:30 a.m, and Victor stayed in bed all day, and did not rise until 1:30. We stayed together in the flat, neither of us leaving for any reason. We left the flat the following Monday to go to work." With his partner vouching for him, Miller was temporarily in the clear, but he was not completely ruled out as a suspect, particularly given his criminal history. In 1976, a 21-year-old Miller was charged with assault and possession of a dangerous weapon, for which he was sentenced at Dudley Crown Court to 4 years imprisonment, although just 2 years later he would be back on the streets. In the year he was released, Miller struck again, at the beginning of December 1978, when he attacked a pair of 12-year-old boys. stabbing one of them in the chest. Fortunately, the youth survived, with his attacker being sentenced to 7 years for malicious wounding with intent to cause bodily harm, and 3 charges of indecent assault. During his confinement, Miller would be placed in Gloucester Prison, where he became acquainted with fellow inmate Trevor Peacher, and their relationship began, with it being claimed the pair were often seen walking hand in hand while in the exercise yard. The reason for Trevor's incarceration would increase the suspicions of those investigating Stuart's murder, as he had been convicted in 1980 after abducting a 13-year-old paperboy, whom he took back to his flat, where over a 7-hour period the teenager was threatened with a knife and assaulted. By 1984, both men had been released from prison and had taken up residence in the first-floor flat at Lennox Gardens, where they settled into life as a regular couple. Miller was working as a computer operator and warehouseman, while in his spare time both he and Trevor visited various gay bars and clubs, where Miller often performed in drag. The pair had started saving to buy a home together, and it seemed as though their relationship was going from strength to strength as they focused on their future. However, in 1988, the pair had come to the attention of the police once more. But the account of Richard Holden and Anthony Dingley stated only one man had been involved in their incident. And during an ID parade, Anthony positively identified Miller. Police had also recovered tyre impressions at the scene of Richard's attack, which matched Miller's vehicle, and footprints were discovered to be identical to those found in a loft where Miller worked, and he was the only person who accessed that area. However, investigators were unable to connect Trevor to the attacks. Therefore, only Miller would be charged with the abduction and sexual assault of Richard Holden. Having appeared in court in connection to this offence, the questioning of Miller continued, with Chief Inspector Ammon Croft later reflecting on his interviews. He stated, "We were dealing with an articulate, intelligent man, with many character complexities. He approached the interviews with a determination not to confess, giving lengthy replies to the most routine questions. But as the officers persevered, Miller began to crack, and slowly he disclosed details regarding what happened that Sunday, with Miller admitting that his normally strong relationship with Trevor was going through a rough patch, and the couple had been arguing more than usual. The police would get the answers they were seeking on the 31st of January 1988, when Miller not only admitted to murdering Stuart, but as stated, he led them to where they could find the body. He would appear at Hereford Magistrates Court on the 1st of February, where Miller was formally charged with the murder of Stuart Gough. The 32-year-old made a statement via his solicitor, Anthony Davis, in which he stated, "I have been charged with the murder of Stuart Gough, and I do not intend to defend their charge. I fully accept what I have done, and I have cooperated fully with the police. I can never make up for taking Stuart from his family, but I would ask, and indeed trust, that justice will be done, and that I will receive the maximum sentence available from the courts. I make this public statement now through Mr. Davies to save speculation and further distress to Stuart's family and all concerned." Reacting to this turn of events, Geoffrey Gough expressed his relief, stating, "I am so glad he's at peace now. I know we can have him back." Further revelations would emerge when it was revealed the following day that Trevor Peacher confessed covering up for Miller, with him telling the police, "If I had had any inkling that he was the man responsible, I would have told the police myself." He added, "I didn't believe he had done it. I acted like an idiot, but I loved the guy. I told the police he was with me, although I knew that was not true." He proceeded to talk about their 5-year relationship and expressed how he felt about the situation, stating, What has happened has come as a horrendous shock. I know people will think he is an animal, but I have seen the other side of him. I gave Victor a good home and all the material things. I spent £2,000 on his car. He has meant the world to me for years. The last time the couple had seen each other was at Hereford Police Station, shortly after Stuart's body had been discovered, where the pair held a brief conversation, during which Peacher asked Miller why he had killed Stuart, receiving the simple response, "I don't know." Peacher would also undertake an ill-timed newspaper interview, which was published on the same day as the inquest into the teenager's death. In the article, Miller's partner expressed pity for himself, stating, "I can't stand anymore. Why has he done this to me? Why am I being crucified? I still love Vic. I can't condone what he says he has done." As he lamented his lot, the Gough family were forced to endure further heartache as an inquest into Stuart's death was conducted. Held in Gloucester the day after Miller's court appearance, the inquest was presided over by District Coroner David Billingham, during which the details of the 14-year-old's horrific ordeal came to light. It was revealed that Stuart's partially clothed remains had been discovered in a beauty spot popular with courting couples, known as Cuckoo Pen Lane. This picturesque location would be in stark contrast to the brutality inflicted upon the teenager. 14-year-old Stuart had been sexually assaulted and strangled. The teenager had also sustained extensive injuries to his body, while several blows to the head from a heavy object caused severe damage, which had resulted in formal identification needing to be carried out using fingerprints. With the details of his son's injuries now exposed to the world, Geoffrey Gough spoke out during a press conference. With all the anger of a grieving father, he stated about Miller, "I hope he rots in hell." He also responded to a question regarding the reinstatement of the death penalty, an issue which had started to be raised amidst the publicity of the case. He did reply that he thought Miller should, quote, "get everything that is coming to him," adding, "I can't understand how an animal like him could do such a thing to a child. In fact, I'd like to rephrase that. Animals wouldn't do that to their own kind. I think he is a disease to our society, and a disease which should be got rid of." Proving Geoffrey's assertion right that the man who had killed his son was not safe to be in society, on the 4th of February 1988, Miller would appear in court once again, this time charged with kidnapping and carrying out an act of gross indecency against a 13-year-old boy on the 13th of December 1984 in Pattingham, Staffordshire. Following this court appearance, news would break that more evidence had been discovered, this time near the village of Stretton in Staffordshire, 50 miles away from Hagley. Amongst these items was an inhaler, clothing, a watch, and a newspaper delivery bag, all of which were believed to belong to Stuart, a teenager whose parents were preparing to say their final goodbyes. Yet it would be the actions of Trevor Peacher that would hit the headlines next. He had been released on bail, with a file being submitted to the Crown Prosecution Service to see whether charges would be brought against him in regards to supplying a false alibi. He made the headlines on the morning of Stuart's funeral. Trevor had been scrutinised and vilified by the community due to his connection with Miller. Reports stated that Miller's partner had been rushed to hospital, having been found with self-inflicted injuries to the wrist by Mrs. Betty Seabridge. She had received a phone call from her neighbour Trevor, during which he spoke in regard to Stuart, quote, "That poor little boy, that poor little boy. I do not know how he," meaning Miller, "did it." When Peacher called Betty again, shortly afterwards, he stated he had cut his wrist, prompting the neighbour to ring for an ambulance. As Peacher floundered in his own despair, he would agree to an interview with Sue Smith of the Sandwell Evening Mail, which was conducted from his hospital bed. During the interview, he acknowledged his past conviction and spoke out regarding his lack of involvement in the murder of Stuart, stating, "Everyone wants me to kill myself because of what I did before. I've done nothing in connection with Stuart. Why won't people leave me alone?" Meanwhile, Stuart's loved ones were also under the spotlight, facing the climax of 14 days of uncertainty, which had ended in the heartbreaking discovery of his body. On the 9th of February 1988, his family and community were able to lay the teenager to rest during a funeral paid for by the National Federation of Retail Newsagents. His disappearance had galvanized the community. For 2 weeks they had come together to aid in the search and offer support to the Gough family, and on that cold February morning, they were united in grief. Lining the route of the funeral procession, the village fell silent. Shops, businesses and schools closed for the day as a mark of respect. 50 wreaths had been donated, including one poignant reminder of what Stuart had been doing that Sunday morning, braving the icy winter weather to deliver papers like thousands of boys and girls all over the country. And a symbol of that was the characteristic paper bag, which had been recreated in flowers at the request of Malcolm and Gillian Higgins. As mourners dispersed from the graveside, Geoffrey and Jean Gough remained, alongside their 2 youngest boys. The quartet held each other close, while the grief-stricken mother clung to Stuart's school jumper, cradling it to her chest, a lasting remnant of the boy she had lost. A child who was remembered during a special memorial service on the 25th of March 1988, Stuart's 15th birthday. As part of the commemorations, Geoffrey and Stuart's brother Mark undertook the journey to the spot where their loved one's body was found. It was a location they hoped would no longer be remembered for the life lost, but for the life Stuart had led, with his brother and father planting an oak tree close to the spot where their loved one had died, and Geoffrey uttering, "As this tree grows, so will the memory of Stuart. We would ask you to look after the tree in the years to come." As July the 16th approached, the parents would face a difficult decision. They had saved up for Stuart and his mum to attend the Michael Jackson concert, which was due to be held on that date. Stuart loved the famous singer, but Jean could not bring herself to attend the concert without him. Instead, she gifted the tickets to the son of the paper shop owner, Malcolm Higgins, as a way of thanking them for their support. The family had been surrounded by the love and support of the entire community, who had shared their pain and grief. Yet following the funeral, the mood in the village began to turn from grief to anger, and a desire to bring about change in the justice system, with the once quiet murmurings regarding capital punishment becoming a deafening call for action. The subject would prove divisive, with one gathering in the community centre being interrupted by Reverend Alan Brooks Bank, who pleaded with the residents to consider the bereaved family and condemned the organisers for using the tragedy to further their own agendas. Despite this appeal, the meetings continued, and the campaign gained traction. A petition requesting the reinstatement of the death penalty was signed by 60,000 people, alongside thousands of letters of support, all of which were delivered to 10 Downing Street. It was an issue the Prime Minister at the time, Margaret Thatcher, was eager to debate, with the Iron Lady alongside 2,000 of her peers prepared to vote in favour of the reintroduction of the death penalty. However, the motion was ultimately defeated. Throughout this climate of high emotion, Victor Miller was on remand in Bristol prison, awaiting his day in court, his primary visitors being his legal team and the police, with the latter conducting numerous interviews as officers from forces around the country wished to speak to Miller regarding unsolved cases in their jurisdiction. This questioning led to Miller being connected with 2 more abductions, both involving 16-year-olds, for which he would be charged on the 27th of July 1988. The full details of his crimes and his confession came to light during his short trial and sentencing hearing at Birmingham Crown Court on November 3rd, 1988, with Victor Miller entering a guilty plea on all 9 charges against him. During the proceedings, the details of Miller's confession were disclosed, in which he had told the police that in the week prior to Stuart's abduction, he and Trevor had been going through a rough patch, and Miller alleged that following an angry, alcohol-fueled argument, he felt an urge to carry out his dark desires. He began trawling the countryside in search of a paperboy to kidnap, with the 32-year-old admitting that they made the perfect targets due to their age and the likelihood they would be alone. Chillingly, he stated, "It's the ideal time when nobody's around and it's quiet, and there are boys around of the age I go for." Miller went on to tell detectives how he had coaxed Stuart over to his car, and when the boy was close enough, he forced the youth at knife point into the back seat, before speeding off away from Hagley and making his way 45 miles southwest to the location near the village of Bromsborough, a place he knew would provide him with the seclusion he required. He would also disclose to the police during his interviews that area and the school had held a special significance to him, as it was where he had his first homosexual experience, and it was now a place he would make Stuart endure the final brutal moments of his life. Once alone with his captive, he pulled Stuart from the vehicle, forced the terrified teenager to the ground, and removed his clothing from the waist down. Then he beat and sexually abused the youngster. Seeing the cowering and injured child before him, Miller stood over his victim and claimed that for 20 minutes he pondered the boy's fate. It was allegedly the love he had for his partner Trevor which drove Miller to end Stuart's life. Afraid that if he let him go, the boy would cause him to be arrested, and he would ultimately be separated from the man he loved. With his mind made up, Miller claimed he initially attempted to strangle the boy with a shoelace. When this failed, he grabbed a nearby rock, which weighed roughly 7 pounds, and brought it down upon the boy's head several times. When Stuart became motionless and silent, Miller rolled his partially clothed body into a drainage gullet, which he then covered with foliage in an effort to conceal the dreadful deed. Attempting to justify his decision to kill Stuart rather than let him go, Miller would tell the court, "I kept thinking about Trevor and his involvement with me and our finances. He couldn't keep things going without me. I was stood for 20 or 25 minutes and in a lot of turmoil over what I could do. I knew if I took Stuart back, I would be arrested, and everything Trevor and I had worked for and our feelings would go. If I'd been on my own, I would have let him go, but there was Trevor to consider. It was the only person who loved me, the dearest person I've got in my life. The effect it would have on him would have been too great." During the court proceedings, it was pointed out that following these admissions, Miller volunteered to lead the police to the location of both the body and Stuart's belongings, bringing some semblance of closure to the teenager's family, but nothing could make up for the heinous decision he made that Sunday morning. It would also emerge later that Miller had written a letter in which he disclosed that, as police had suspected, he had been in Hagley the day before Stuart's abduction, and he detailed how he had spotted another paperboy, whom he had asked for directions, and subsequently followed. But he was forced to give up his pursuit when the boy disappeared. This letter was detailing the lucky escape of Anthony Dingley. But Anthony, Richard and Stuart were not Miller's only victims. His counsel, Gareth Williams QC, disclosing on Miller's behalf that he had been a prolific offender over a period of 15 years, admitting to at least 29 assaults. However, not all of these could be verified, meaning he was not formally charged for 20 of them. These attacks were strikingly similar in their commission, with Miller targeting an individual who was alone in an isolated area, usually a country road, such as the 21-year-old man in 1984 who was walking along a quiet lane near Litchfield. Miller pushed him into the back of a van, taking him away from the scene to another remote location, where he forced the young man, under threats of death, to carry out sexual acts. The court heard how this man begged Miller to let him go, telling his attacker that he was due to be married. Yet Miller proceeded to assault him, and after he had finished, he told the man, "You know what I'm going to do now. By rights, I'm supposed to kill you, because if I let you go, you will go and tell someone. It's no use, I've got to kill you." However, on this occasion, Miller changed his mind and released the man. These offences had occurred after Miller had been released from Gloucester prison, having served just 4 out of the 7 years he had been sentenced to for the attack on the two 12-year-old boys. More shockingly was that when Miller struggled to find work, he was offered a placement through a government-funded scheme, which provided him a job as a handyman and driver for an organisation called the Crypt. It was a role which would see Miller working with children, with a solicitor for the organisation later stating that they were aware of his criminal record and as such had taken precautions, including not allowing him unsupervised access to minors. Miller did have access to the organisation's minibus, which he was expected to use in order to collect and drop off children at various community groups and events. But it was the access to this vehicle which also allowed him to carry out his abductions and assaults. One such incident mirrored the abduction of Stuart, as he snatched a 13-year-old boy who was delivering newspapers, forced him into the vehicle and drove the youth 15 miles west of Wolverhampton to the town of Bridgnorth, where the boy was subjected to unspeakable acts. Although Miller would not kill this boy, he would change his life forever, as he repeated the assaults on the teenager numerous times over a 12-month period, swearing the child to secrecy, a promise the boy kept out of fear, with it being revealed in court by prosecutor Anthony Palmer QC that the minor had suffered, quote, "an appalling reaction" 2 years later. Miller had also targeted other individuals in the years leading up to the murder of Stuart. Roaming the Midlands, he struck in Wolverhampton, Lichfield and Adridge. With his criminal history exposed, the defence led by Gareth Williams did not deny the perilous nature of the man who stood in the dock, with the barrister stating, "He is an extremely dangerous man, and it is reasonable to contemplate that he will commit murder again," going on to acknowledge that Miller was likely to offend again, adding that his client was reconciled to never being released, and wishes me to ask your lordship to make that recommendation. In response, the judge, Mr. Justice Philip Otten, agreed with the defence's assertion that Miller was a high-risk individual, recalling that medical professionals had labelled him a sadistic sexual psychopath, whom had been preoccupied with sex and violence and was deemed to have a grossly abnormal personality disorder. Passing a sentence of 30 years on Miller, the judge stated, "There are compelling, overwhelming and unanimous medical opinions, and your own wish to remain in prison for the rest of your life. The public deserve to be assured you will never be released." It was a verdict which prompted Miller to smile and rub his hands as he was led from the dock. Following the hearing, a press conference was held in the community centre, a place the residents of the area had gathered daily during the search for Stuart, and once more they converged. This time they would hear the family's response to the verdict, with Stuart Gough stating, "I think that, other than capital punishment, it was the best we could hope for. I hope he does stay in prison for the rest of his life. and that he does suffer every minute of his remaining years. Stuart is gone forever from our family, and nothing can make it easier to bear. We can never let an animal like Miller loose on the streets. When a person like Miller goes out and murders a child, I think he should be exterminated. Stuart will always be there in our memories, but we have not yet come to terms with his death. Continuing to express the impact his son's murder had caused, the bereaved father tearfully added, "I see Stuart every morning when I go up the road, past the spot where he was kidnapped, and every day it gets worse. It will never heal. I know it's hard, but I pray every night to die so I can be with him." His wife Jean would also voice her satisfaction with the sentence Miller had received, and elaborated on her husband's words by saying, "I hope that this will be a deterrent to others, so that we can all live in a safe society. Please tell everyone that life does mean life in prison. I hope he will always help us to ensure that any attempts at having freed will not succeed." The now 70-year-old Miller is adamant he should remain behind bars. Another individual who would see prison time was Victor's partner Trevor Peacher, who, just 2 days after his lover had been convicted, hired an agent and tried to sell his story to the newspapers, including the Sunday Mirror, but the paper refused, with a rival publication picking up the story instead. Having profited from his partner's actions, Peacher would also face consequences for his part in the crime. On February 13, 1989, he appeared at Stafford Crown Court. Peacher entered a plea of guilty to the charge of perverting the course of justice, having been the one who provided Miller an alibi within days of the murder. He recalled that Miller had acted strangely after the news broke of Stuart's disappearance. He seemed anxious and had a keen interest in the story whenever it was featured on the television or in the newspapers. Mr. David Krugman, acting on the part of the prosecution, would suggest that Peacher had a greater knowledge of Miller's actions. He knew his partner was not at home at the time the incidents involving Richard Holden and Anthony Dingley had taken place, nor was he in the flat on the Sunday, as Peacher had claimed to police on the 20th of January, just 3 days after Stuart had gone missing. However, the defence would counter this by claiming that Peacher only became aware of the true extent of the crime when he was notified by police, with it being stated that upon the officers informing him of the details, Peacher replied, "The bastard, he never said anything about that. All he said was that he followed a boy." The defence would go on to suggest that he covered for his partner, whom he believed had merely stalked a boy, because Trevor was a battered spouse, who had possibly suffered psychological, physical, or financial abuse at the hands of Miller, resulting in Peacher being too afraid to defy him. A potential sign of the hold Miller had over Peacher was evident when the former partner took to the stand, and Trevor tearfully revealed that even a year after the murder he still loved Miller, but added that he could not condone what his former lover had done. The defence would ask the judge, Justice Tucker, to consider the dynamics of the couple's relationship and the battered spouse argument as mitigating factors as to why Peacher had provided the alibi. After hearing both sides of the argument, Judge Justice Tucker handed Peacher a sentence of 3 years in prison, ensuring that he too would receive consequences for his actions. After all, Trevor had prevented the police from apprehending Miller sooner. In doing so, he had forced the family to wait longer to find out what had happened to Stuart, and no matter how long that wait can be, for any loved one going through what the Goughs did, it feels like an eternity. Stuart's family experienced grief in their own ways. Jean was devastated by the loss of her eldest son, and was compelled to give up work, while her 2 younger sons, Mark and Richard, tried to stay strong for their mother. Many noted that Mark was often seen at Stuart's grave, where he was overheard telling his older sibling jokes. In the years that followed, the two brothers lived the life that was denied to Stuart, leaving school, falling in love, getting jobs, and starting their own families. Their father, Geoffrey, was very open about how the loss had affected him, recalling that some nights the pain would be so unbearable that he prayed for death to take him so he could be with Stuart. He regularly visited his son's grave, and upon acquiring a job in the local school as a caretaker, Geoffrey worked through his breaks, seeing it as a way of preventing his mind from focusing on his loss. The bereaved father managed to channel this grief and need for a distraction back into the community who had been there for him and his family through the hardest moments of their lives, many of whom had now become friends. Geoffrey participated in victim support groups, sharing his story and advice with others who had experienced death and tragedy. He also became an integral part of the Boy Scouts and St. John's Ambulance. Through his desire to give back to the area, he was made president of the Hagley Community Association and elected a parish councillor. His determination to uplift the community who had supported him was rewarded in 2005 when he was given an MBE for his services to the community. But one memory always haunted Geoffrey, recalling the night of Saturday the 16th of January 1988, hearing his 14-year-old son bid him good night and disappear up the stairs, not knowing that that would be the last time he would see him. The following morning, Stuart Gough woke up before his family and headed out the door to do a paper round, like thousands of boys and girls all over the world. And while the Gough family received answers as to why their son hadn't come home, there are the families of children like Johnny Gosh, Eugene Martin, Mark Allen and Carl Bridgewater who are still confronted with the unknown. Thank you for joining me for It's Murder Up North. Another episode is coming soon.
So in the meantime, keep an eye on those shadows.
Ryan Seacrest here. When you have a busy schedule, it's important to maximize your downtime. One of the best ways to do that is by going to ChumbaCasino.com. Chumba Casino has all your favorite social casino games like spin slots, bingo, and solitaire that you can play for free for a chance to redeem some serious prizes. So hop on to ChumbaCasino.com now and live the Chumba life. Sponsored by Chumba Casino.
No purchase necessary. VGW Group. Void where prohibited by law. 21 plus. Terms and conditions apply.